I'm Gilda Barabino. I'm president of Olin College, where I'm also serving as a professor of biomedical and chemical engineering. I'm so honored to serve as co-chair of this amazing summit and moderator for this session, which is intended to provide an opportunity for us to reflect and consider next steps towards meaningful change. The time for change is now. We are fortunate to have three esteemed panelists to help us set the vision for the work to come. Dr. Marie Bernard is the National Institutes of Health Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity. Previously, she served as Deputy Director of the National Institute on Aging. She leads NIH's newly formed Unite Initiative to end structural racism, and you'll hear more about that when she gives her remarks. Joining Dr. Bernard is Dr. Ellen Ochoa. Dr. Ochoa has had a career as a research engineer and astronaut. She directed NASA's Johnson Space Center from 2013 until her retirement in 2018. She currently chairs the National Science Board, and she'll be able to share with us recommendations coming from its recent report, Vision 2030. And then rounding out our panel is Dr. Shirley Tilghman. Dr. Tilghman served as Princeton's 19th president from 2001 to 2013. She returned to the faculty as professor of molecular biology and public affairs. She's an exceptional leader known for her research, as well as her leadership on behalf of the advancement of women and minorities. She will speak to what universities need to do to expand participation in STEM and medicine. So we'll move to our first presentation by Dr. Bernard. Dr. Bernard, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you are seeing my screen, and you're now seeing my slides in presentation mode. Is that correct?
All looks good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm really happy and excited to have the opportunity to talk with you today. Very specifically, I'm going to talk to you about the NIH Unite Initiative that was established and officially unveiled February 26th of this year. It's an initiative to end structural racism, an ambitious goal. How did we get here? We were really impressed with the events of 2020. They brought into sharp relief the ongoing reality of racial injustice in our country and the responsibility that we all have to address the issue. This led to a series of intense institute and center director meetings to identify initial issues. We had a couple of self-assembled affinity groups as well, something called ACRE, 8 Concepts of Racial Equity, and the African American and Black Senior Scientists, as well as our internal Anti-Harassment Steering Committee that contributed to some very candid conversations. And it led to a shared commitment to address structural racism. We felt that we could not let this pivotal moment pass. And certainly this was unveiled February 26th. The murders of 6 Asian women in the month of March just put a punctuation point to the need for us to address this. What were the initial issues that were identified? That we must ensure that biomedical research and the administrative system that supports it is devoid of hostility grounded in race, sex, and other federally protected characteristics. So in this new initiative, we are committed to delineating elements that may perpetuate structural racism in biomedical research, both within NIH and in the extramural community, the things that lead to lack of personnel inclusiveness, equity, and diversity. We feel that all ideas must be given an equal and fair review, regardless of the dominant paradigm and who puts the ideas forward. And it was, as has been really demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic, health disparities and inequities continue to contribute to morbidity and mortality in our nation, and we must redress fundamental causes and find effective interventions. So what we unveiled is something that we are calling Unite, representative of 5 interacting work streams. 1, to understand stakeholder experiences through listening and learning. Another, to do new research on health disparities, minority health, and health equity. An I group that's looking internally at the NIH culture and structure to make sure that we have true equity, inclusion, and excellence and role model for the external world. A T committee that's looking at us being transparent, communicating, and being accountable for our actions. And an E committee that's looking at the extramural research ecosystem. What sorts of changes in policies, culture, and structure need to be made to promote workforce diversity? So, February 26th, we made a number of commitments, and I'm going to recap for you what those were and the progress from those. And then I'll talk about the ways forward. We said on that day that we would publicly commit to identifying and correcting any NIH policies or practices that may have helped to perpetuate structural racism. And in fact, Francis Collins, the NIH director, made this statement. To those individuals in the biomedical research enterprise who've endured disadvantages due to structural racism, I am truly sorry. NIH is committed to instituting new ways to support diversity, equity, and inclusion, and identifying and dismantling any policies and practices at our own agency that may harm our workforce and our science. We also committed to continue to aggressively implement approaches to address the Ginter gap and enhance portfolio diversity. The Ginter gap, I'm sure you're familiar, it's the persistent disadvantage that African American and Black scientists were found to have in receipt of R01 grants as evaluated by Donna Ginter and colleagues in 2011, reported in Science in 2011. In 2013, as the first Chief Officer of Scientific Workforce Diversity arrived, Dr. Hannah Valentine. This is what the data looked like. There's a 2018 point, and these are the 2020 data that show there is a trend of improvement with more in the way of African American and Black applicants, but small numbers of all underrepresented groups. And similarly, there is a trend towards a better success rate, though still less than that of non-Hispanic whites. The major thing is that the numbers are very small. So we really have a lot of work to continue doing, and we're committed to doing that. We also said that we would launch a multi-phase, tiered, and integrated common fund initiative focused on transformative health disparities research to reduce disparities and enhance equity. And sure enough, a month later, there were two common funding opportunity announcements released, one on transformative research in general, and the other on transformative research at minority serving institutions. There's a commitment of up to $24 million for the first 3 years, a total commitment of $60 million. We said we would also ensure a robust NIH-wide commitment to a then in development National Institutes of Minority Health and Health Disparities funding opportunity announcement focused on structural racism and discrimination and its impact on health. And that funding opportunity announcement was released March 23rd with 25 institute centers and offices committed, a commitment of up to $30.8 million. A bonus, the NIH-wide Brain Group came up with a funding opportunity announcement that many of us are really very interested in. It's a funding opportunity announcement that will be evaluating plans to enhance diverse perspectives as part of the scoring. The first experiment at using diversity considerations as a scoring criterion as opposed to you score and then separately you look at the diversity, and it's looking at diversity of the personnel who are involved as well as if it's human research, the population that's the subject of research. So we're going to be very interested in the impact of this and whether it can be generalized. We also said that we would develop a sustainable process to systematically gather and make public the demographics of our internal and external workforce. And to that end, the Office of Extramural Research has now published in its data book data regarding our grant recipients by race, ethnicity, and disability status. This is added to the information that we have based upon sex and career stage. And to role model what we would hope academic and research institutions will do, we also have posted our internal data looking at our staff by job classification and race ethnicity, and intend to continue following this. Looking internally, we said that we would implement policy changes that promote anti-racism and remove barriers to professional growth for our staff. And to that end, we established what we're calling the Anti-Racism Steering Committee. It's now 480 plus strong members. And it's meant to address issues regarding policies and procedures that lend themselves to racial discrimination. It's not meant to address individual cases. We have an Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion that handles EEO cases. But this gives you a sense of the broad representation of NIH staff by race, ethnicity, by job categorization, and by pay levels. We said that we were going to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer at each institute and center. We've modified that to make it a performance expectation for the institute directors to be accountable for equity, diversity, and inclusion across their institute as well as across NIH with the officer or other means that it's appropriate, and in coordination with my office and the Equity and Diversity and Inclusion Office. And we said that we were going to expand a very successful intramural NIH program called the Distinguished Scholars Program. This is a program that brings in scientists into the tenure track program as cohorts, gives them extra networking, mentoring, support for their research, and it's been associated with a real uptick in the diversity of people in the tenure track. We're looking to hire senior investigators with tenure who will also become part of this program, and there's a strong commitment to move forward on that. So we've done quite a bit from February 26th to now, and we said when we unveiled this on February 26th that it was a marathon. We weren't sure what the path ahead exactly would look like, but that we would have as mile markers our check-ins with the advisory committee to the director every June and December. So June 11th, we did that check-in and we did that recounting that I just shared with you. And these are the things that we are envisioning going forward as we shared with them. We're very pleased that President Biden has proposed increased funding to help health disparities, minority, and health equity research by increasing the funding of some of the lead institutes for those forms of research, the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparity, National Institute of Nursing Research, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and Fogarty International Center. We will see what Congress chooses to do relative to his proposal. We plan to continue to listen and learn from a wide variety of stakeholders. And to those of you who responded to our RFI that was issued March 1, thank you. We have more than 1,100 responses that we are evaluating, but we want to continue to gather data to help make sure that this initiative is going in the right direction. And we're particularly interested in those who are not frequently engaged. We envision developing actionable data dashboards to look at what's going on internally with our workforce and to look at what's happening in our investment in health disparities and health equity research. We're going to be encouraging the institutes and centers to develop disease and topic specific projects or solicitations in health disparities and health equity. We're going to be looking at programs to spur institutional culture change in support of inclusivity and equity. We're very specifically going to be encouraging the institutes and centers to support a program that's led by the National Institute of General Medical Sciences that focuses on STEM education for the K through 12 population. And we'll be examining how our staff, our program officers, our scientific review officers interact with you, the outside community, to make sure that there's not bias or inequities that have been introduced into those interactions that are so important when it comes to applications for grants and funding. We intend to expand our interactions with and support of historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and other minority serving institutions. And looking internally again, we intend to change our physical and virtual representation so that when people are fully back to the physical workplace and they walk around the NIH campus, they'll see much more diversity on the walls of the clinical center and the NIH director's building and other areas. And we intend to have some internal guidance to help our staff in reporting racial discrimination or some strengthened internal guidance. I'll close by saying that this quote by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King has been really inspirational for us. He stated that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He went on to say that we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly, affects all indirectly. And that really is representative of our philosophy here. We've heard from many that they don't necessarily see themselves in this, but we intend to step back and look at all of our systems to try to make sure that they're equitable for all. We summarize this in a commentary that was published in Cell on June 10th. And this is the Unite group, my group of 80 plus best friends over the last many months. I've been very privileged to co-lead this initiative with Dr. Larry Tabak, the NIH Principal Deputy Director, and Dr. Alfred Johnson, the Deputy Director for Management. And we really invite all of you to give feedback to us when we have our listening sessions. If you go to the NIH Unite website, whatever way works best for you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Bernard. That was so helpful to see the leadership that NIH is putting forth with this aggressive and very broad initiative. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Ochoa to tell us a bit about the approach from the National Science Board and the National Science Foundation. Dr. Ochoa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. On behalf of the National Science Board, first of all, thank you all for hosting this important event, and I'm really pleased to be part of it. You know, it's important, critical actually, that the national academies focus on this area because it takes everyone in the science and engineering community to intentionally take action in order for processes to change. The National Academies has hosted several town halls in the last year that dealt with some aspect of what we're talking about in these 2 days, some of which I was able to tune into. And I applaud the academies for instituting the position of Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. So let me add my welcome to Laura Castillo-Page. For those who may not know, the National Science Board is the governing board of the National Science Foundation, along with the director, the federal agency that funds fundamental research in all non-medical fields and nurtures and supports tens of thousands of talented people embedded in every sector of our economy as researchers, educators, technicians, entrepreneurs, and innovators. The board also has another role in advising Congress and the President and administration on science and engineering issues, including the importance of developing STEM talent and barriers to attracting and retaining people in STEM. Just a little over a year ago, the board released a report called Vision 2030 to provide a vision of where the U.S. science and engineering enterprise must be in the year 2030 for the U.S. to be globally competitive and stay at the forefront of innovation. Vision 2030 lays out the actions that the NSB, NSF, other federal agencies, organizations like the National Academies, and others can take to achieve this vision. The report noted 4 areas where actions are particularly needed to ensure that American discoveries continue to power our economic growth and enhance our national security. First, we need to better deliver benefits from research. Second, we need to develop STEM talent nationwide to build the workforce America needs to invent the future. Third, we need to expand the geography of innovation so everyone in the country can participate in and benefit from science and engineering research and development. And fourth, we need to foster a global community that attracts international partnerships and talent. While diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism can be addressed across all 4 of these areas, for today, I'll focus my remarks specifically on the developing STEM talent priority. Of course, talent is the treasure on which U.S. prosperity, health, and security depend, and America's diversity is our strength. Even though the U.S. science and engineering workforce has grown faster than the overall workforce for several decades, the U.S. isn't developing the full potential of its people. Just as one broad example, based on test scores, U.S. science and math education in K through 12 is mediocre and stagnant relative to other countries. Over the next decade, our nation must focus heavily on developing America's STEM talent at all educational levels and looking at post-secondary from skilled technical workers to PhD researchers. Vision 2030 also challenges all of us to do more to recruit and retain the underrepresented groups in STEM so that we can take advantage of the talent that exists in every demographic and geographic location. And I know I don't have to tell this audience that despite some progress, women and racial and ethnic minorities remained underrepresented relative to their proportions in the US population. And I was going to show just one figure from our report today. So I'm sure you probably can't read this, but it looks at 4 different groups that are underrepresented, and the filled in pictures represent those people who are in today's science and engineering workforce. The unfilled pictures represent the additional people needed in the workforce in 2030 if we want it to be representative of the US population at that time. And in order to do so, the board estimates that the number of women would need to nearly double, Black or African Americans more than double, Hispanic or Latinos would need to triple, and American Indian or Alaskan Natives to quadruple. To be ready for 2030, the US will need a research and development workforce that pushes the frontiers of knowledge and a much larger STEM-capable US workforce in which many more Americans have the skills to flourish. Shortly after the NSB released Vision 2030, and in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, our nation engaged in long overdue discussion around the impact of systemic racism in every aspect of society, including in our science and engineering enterprise. And all over social media, we saw Black members share their deeply personal experiences pursuing STEM degrees and careers. Many organizations and institutions responded by clarifying their positions on the value of diversity. The National Science Foundation, NSF, and the board, NSB, acted in response to calls for transformational change. One of the first actions that NSF Director Sethuraman Panchanathan took when he began, just over a year ago, was to establish NSF's Racial Equity Task Force to assess both NSF internal processes and culture that affect agency staff and its external programs and approaches to addressing these missing millions in STEM. And we'll expect to hear more broadly about that later this year. The board released a statement on racism in science and engineering. And we didn't want to just make it a statement. So in it, we did vow to act intentionally to remove barriers and of course, call for greater inclusion of Black people at all levels of STEM. We recognize the unique legacy and important role of historically Black colleges and universities in contributing to the science and engineering research enterprise and educating future STEM leaders. In the year that's passed, the board continues to hold itself accountable by acting and advocating for more inclusive environments and by partnering with NSF to strengthen research training pathways, reduce barriers, and broaden participation. For example, in our public meetings over the last year, the board has featured panels focused on the Black experience in STEM, on the impact of COVID on women in STEM, roadblocks to STEM graduate student retention, and lessons from minority-serving institutions. And in fact, I'd like to thank the National Academies because we've reached out to help us identify excellent panelists for these presentations. A few years ago, NSF was the lead funder for the important and oft-cited National Academies report on sexual harassment in STEM. Informed by that report, NSF developed its new term and condition on sexual and other forms of harassment protected under federal civil rights laws, including racial harassment. And that term and condition requires a grant awardee's institution to notify NSF of any findings of harassment or imposition of any administrative action relating to harassment. This is just part of helping to foster an environment that's welcoming and inclusive culture, from the classroom to the laboratory to the boardroom. The science and engineering community must also respectfully partner with every community with which it engages. Earlier this year, NSF held a town hall to discuss the development of its tribal consultation policy. Such a policy would consider Indigenous communities affected by NSF-funded research and guide researchers on how to respectfully engage with these sovereign nations. It would also help ensure that the impacts of science and engineering aren't detrimental, particularly to those in the most marginalized groups. Relevant data showing trends is critical to understanding the full picture of STEM education and the workforce. And of course, we've heard so much data over the last 2 days. The board routinely partners with NSF's National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, NCSCS, an independent federal statistical center, on its Science and Engineering Indicators report. As part of the board's work to raise visibility for the missing millions, we worked with NCSCS to add data collection about the skilled technical workforce, including the technical and community colleges that provide education and training. In fact, the latest version of the biennial report, Women, Minorities, and Persons with Disabilities in Science and Engineering, that NCSCS recently released, now includes these data, providing a more complete picture of the state of STEM education and employment for these historically underrepresented groups. NSF's congressionally mandated advisory committee, the Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science and Engineering, known as CEOS, of which our moderator, Gilda Barabino, is a member, is a critical partner in developing innovative recommendations to create a more diverse and inclusive STEM workforce. Nearly 10 years ago, CEOS challenged NSF to act boldly on broadening participation in STEM. And this resulted in what is known as NSF Includes, a comprehensive national initiative that accelerates diversity and inclusion in STEM by connecting individuals, alliances, pilot programs, federal agencies, educational institutions, and other entities in a network that serves as a model for interagency collaboration. The board is in the midst of building a closer relationship with CEOS. The board vice chair, Dr. Victor McCrary, and I have presented at the last 3 CEOS meetings, and we've also had CEOS leadership present at a board meeting. We look forward to our December board meeting in which CEOS will present the recommendations from their report that comes out this fall. Of course, other agencies are also working towards transformational change, and we try to keep an eye on that as well, given our broad look at science and engineering across the nation. For example, NASA just launched, so to speak, Mission Equity to assess expanding and modifying NASA's programs, procurements, grants, and policies, and to look at potential barriers and challenges for communities that are historically underrepresented and underserved. And the AAAS Sea Change program, for which NSF provided initial funding, is developing a growing network of institutional accountability and transparency that will help us close the missing millions gap by 2030. This program focuses on changing institutions, which so many of the speakers have talked about as being critical, by having them perform a self-assessment and then develop an action plan. One can imagine a future where institutions who do so and are awarded a high rating are recognized in a variety of ways, including with funding. As both NSB chair and a member of the National Academy of Engineering, I appreciate the efforts that the national academies are taking themselves, not only in holding events like this, but looking at their own processes and membership diversity. We heard about a number of their activities earlier today. For example, that NAE has formed a racial justice and equity committee to look at staffing and membership, and their special nominating committee has helped to identify stellar diverse candidates for membership. The NAS has also a focus on increasing diversity in their membership, including by rewarding sections with diverse candidates with more slots. And this year saw the highest percentage of women in an elected class for NAS, 49%. Another positive step is that all three academies now use the same definitions for minorities, which lines up with the NSF definition that itself comes from the US Census, which allows for improved data comparison and assessment. As I wrap up my remarks, I'd like to challenge all of us to continue the momentum to collect data that will permit us to set meaningful goals and measure our progress on specific outcomes, and to hold ourselves accountable by making our data, goals, and progress publicly available. Those in leadership can reflect the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only by their workforce or membership, but also by who they appoint to decision-making positions and who they select to partner with. As for the National Science Board makeup, every new administration has an opportunity to appoint new board members and to ensure that the board includes leaders who represent the diversity of research and lived experiences and backgrounds of all Americans. And we encourage the new administration to do just that in the class that will be named in 2022. Thanks again for the opportunity to be part of this summit.
And thank you, Dr. Ochoa, for sharing with us the leadership that the National Science Board is putting forth and for giving us that challenge as well. We'll now turn to Dr. Tilghman to round us out. And Dr. Tilghman, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Keith Yamamoto, Gilda, Barabino, and the academies for the opportunity to join my distinguished panelists today. The progress we must make in the coming years to create a more equitable and inclusive scientific ecosystem will depend upon close collaborations between government agencies, particularly the NSF and the NIH, and the universities and colleges that will be training the next generation of scientists, engineers, and mathematicians, as well as providing a welcoming environment in which they can all excel. I'm going to focus my short remarks on the perspective of a former university leader, on the challenges and the opportunities that universities face as they embark upon realizing this important societal goal. I start with the blazingly obvious but crucial point. Progress in bringing greater diversity to colleges and universities will require clear, sustained, and vocal leadership from the very top of the institution. If the president or the chancellor is not fully on board with the mission, I can promise you the change won't happen. Certainly not the kind of institutional change that is sustainable because it has become embedded within the culture of the institution. And this change is not going to happen overnight. I've learned the hard way over time that culture is the hardest thing to change, and that the seismic changes of the kind that we are contemplating in this meeting will require eternal vigilance for the foreseeable future. I learned this lesson in the last several decades of the 20th century, when women were beginning to join the scientific enterprise in greater numbers. There was an optimistic belief at the time that when at some point in the near future we reached a critical mass of women in the academy, we would no longer need to pay attention to gender. That bubble was burst when Nancy Hopkins and her colleagues at MIT conducted their groundbreaking 2000 study that revealed just how deep and largely invisible the bias against women went. And it led many of us to conclude that we needed to take the long view as we imagined a world in which women were full participants in the scientific enterprise and felt that they truly belonged. Here we are in 2021, and the light is still a dim light at the end of the tunnel. So we should be prepared for a long campaign. If I have one worry about the present moment, it is like so many before it. We as a community will tire of this work, or will declare victory after a few modest successes. or we will be distracted by a different issue facing STEM fields. Eternal vigilance needs to be our marching order. Now, it may be obvious why the voice of a leader is so important, but let me iterate some of the underlying reasons. Universities, unlike corporations, do not function with a command and control governance structure. And that, by the way, may be the greatest understatement of this meeting. Much of the critical decision-making happens in a highly disseminated way and requires building consensus across large groups of individuals. When decision-making can be directly influenced by a leader, change can actually happen quite quickly. This explains why so many colleges and universities were able to increase the diversity of their undergraduate student bodies, while at the same time being completely stalled at the graduate and faculty level. Undergraduate admission is controlled by a single office, led by a single dean, who receives his or her instruction directly from the president. Graduate admissions and faculty hiring decisions, in contrast, are largely made at the departmental level and are only ratified at the presidential level. Now, that doesn't mean that leaders cannot influence those decisions, but to effectively do so, the message has to be loud and clear and consistent. There need to be compelling incentives to faculty for increasing diversity. I'll give you one example that has worked well at some universities. At Princeton, we created a target of opportunity program that gave new FTEs to departments who brought forth excellent candidates for faculty positions whose appointment would expand the diversity of the faculty. The extra FTE would eventually have to be absorbed by the department so that they had some skin in the game. But for a significant period of time, the position was an add-on. Departments competed fiercely with one another each year for those appointments. And viewed in retrospect, the program attracted to the university some of its most distinguished faculty. It became a badge of honor to have come through to Princeton through that route, because the successful candidates were competing against all fields, not just their own. A similar approach is also effective with graduate admission. I've never encountered a department that believes their graduate program should not be larger. And offering additional graduate slots to those departments that successfully recruit a more diverse student body works very effectively at motivating an admission committee to do the work to diversify its student body. Leaders can also signal their commitment to the cause of expanding representation by publicly crediting those who lead the charge on campus. Whether the reward comes in the form of salary, additional research funds, sabbatical leaves to focus on the mission, awards, or teaching relief, it matters that those champions of greater equity and inclusion are held up as exemplary members of the community, on a par with the best teachers, the best scholars, the most effective staff. A corollary to this approach is to appoint chairs and deans who believe in the mission, and then to hold them accountable for progress in expanding and making a more inclusive campus. So while I prefer carrots to sticks in accomplishing institutional goals, there's an obvious stick that also works to influence decisions by individual departments. And that is the unwillingness of leadership to sign off on new appointments or graduate student offers if the department has done little work to more broadly look for the best candidates. Once a department realizes that a homogeneous candidate pool and shortlist is not going to win approval to make an offer, they begin to take seriously the goal of making the university look more like America. As we strategize how best to expand representation at the faculty and graduate student levels, we need to be mindful of the unintended consequences that sometimes accompany progress. An issue that has become crystal clear to me in discussions with scientists of color in recent months is the loneliness of being the one person of color in a department or a school. The causes are manifold. Feelings that at every turn you are expected to represent not just yourself, but your ethnicity. Being asked to take on a disproportionate share of mentoring and committee assignments. Being mistaken as an intruder on campus. Having no colleague who can share at a deep level the experience of being a minority. I recall in the early years of being a woman in science how important, even essential it was to have female colleagues who could provide support on the one hand and commiseration on the other. I was asked a long time ago what it takes to succeed as a woman in science, and my answer was grit, a sense of humor, and a failure to recognize reality. The sisterhood in mammalian genetics was critical to getting me through those times. When we look at programs that have succeeded in nourishing and supporting students and faculty of color, many of them have in common the creation of a cohort to specifically avoid the loneliness of a token person of color. The best example, of course, is the much heralded Meyerhoff Scholars Program, inspired by the truly remarkable Freeman Hrabowski at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. The key to that program's success is the support that students receive, not just from the faculty and the staff who are truly committed to their success, but just as importantly, I suspect, from each other. I recall attending a group meeting of Meyerhoff scholars a few years ago when seniors were querying the underclass students about their progress in organic chemistry, watching a number who were struggling raise their hands and being assigned an upper class student to help them through. That is the kind of solidarity that makes a cohort successful. I'm very happy to see that the NIH has begun to support, through its Unite program that we just heard about from Dr. Bernard, the use of cluster hiring as a way, in fact, to help universities grow rapidly their diverse faculty. Now, it will not have escaped anyone's attention that the initiatives that I have described will require new resources for targeted opportunity hires, for extra graduate student slots, for cluster hires, for faculty and staff rewards. And you're right, it will take resources. Anyone who thinks this can be done on the cheap is living in the past, where there is ample evidence that modest efforts produce mediocre results. I've been inspired recently by President Joe Biden's willingness to swing for the fences in his proposals for pandemic relief funds, investment in new infrastructure, and especially his willingness to invest in the future of families. In so doing, he is investing in America's future. We need to channel Joe Biden's ambition and do the same, or a new generation will someday be meeting at the Academy, hopefully this time in person, to discuss what can be done. But I'm aware that I represent a university that has the capacity to take this on, especially this year when endowments have soared. Few other colleges and universities can do so, which is why it is so important that the government, as we just heard, and philanthropy partner with us. My colleagues, Kath Zurasa, Daniel Colon Ramos, Bruce Alberts, Judith Kimball, and Harold Varmus, and I recently wrote a policy piece for science in which we suggested that to really make a dent in expanding the pipeline of diverse scientists, engineers, and mathematicians in biomedical research, the NIH would need to commit upwards of $10 billion annually for the foreseeable future and invest those funds in programs that span from primary school to faculty enrichment. Yes, that is billion with a B, but given the number of times I've heard the word trillion in the last few months, I worry we were being too conservative. But I should emphasize that the infusion of resources needs to flow to individuals as well as institutions. The shocking inequity in relative wealth of underrepresented populations in this country places an extraordinary burden on those who are contemplating the long path to a career in science or medicine. It is not surprising that another characteristic of programs that have successfully diversified the STEM workforce is the provision of generous scholarships and fellowships to reduce financial barriers and the threat of overwhelming debt. Let me conclude with a response I received about the policy piece from a former African-American student of mine. She pointed out that our rather cold-blooded paper did not capture the lived experience of African-Americans who spend their lives in majority white institutions. And she was right. Although some of the blame must fall on an editor at Science who objected to some of our purple prose in a policy piece. And this brings me to the hardest challenge of all, which trumps, oh, that word, all the excellent programs and policies we can put in place. Culture, as I said earlier, is the hardest thing to change. I am painfully reminded of this when I consider the failure of many institutions, including my own, to understand that it was not going to be enough to simply increase the diversity of our undergraduate student bodies and then declare victory. Those students who will inevitably remain a minority on campus were coming to a place that was not designed with them in mind, as Claude Steele said so compellingly in the last panel. The portraits on the walls, the names on the building, the traditions that have arisen when no person of color came through our gates were all still in place and became constant reminders that they'd been invited to join, that being invited to join is not the same as belonging. Confronting the unconscious bias that we know is embedded in each and every one of us, and overcoming the stereotypes our history has created in our minds will be extremely important in remaking our college culture. We still have a long journey ahead to make our institutions fully welcoming to all comers. Thank you, Gilda, for the opportunity to join you today.
Well, thank you so much, Shirley. That was awesome, inspiring, insightful, and lots for us to chew on. We actually have a few more minutes before we need to do our wrap up. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask these amazing women panelists a few questions. So one is, we were thinking about some of the things that are actually invisible, and so CEOS that Ellen mentioned, we one of our things in the coming report is making visible the invisible. And so there are things that people don't see. They're the context that doesn't necessarily get put out there, the stories that go with the data that you see. They're the slights. I mean, there's so many things. There's the lack of disaggregation of the data so that you can get a better sense of people's experiences. So I just want to ask each one of you, if you could speak to what comes to mind to you when you think about making visible the invisible. And Shirley, let's start with you.
I think it's going to be very challenging, Gilda, but I agree with you completely. I think it is absolutely essential. One of the things I vividly recall was a program that I participated in at Princeton for a number of years called Sustained Dialogue. And the purpose was to bring together a group of faculty and students and staff and to really talk about our lived experiences. I think for everyone who participated in those, it was hard work. This was not easy for people to let down their guard and to really speak honestly about their own experience. But I will tell you that the group I was in, one of the faculty members who participated was Cornell West, which, as you can imagine, was a great experience. And Cornell just kept reminding everybody that what we are learning here to do is to walk in someone else's skin. And I've always thought that the only way we're really going to ultimately be able to do what you just suggested, which is to uncover the invisible, is if we are willing to have those kinds of often very difficult and challenging conversations with one another. And here I completely agree with what Claude Steele said, which is it is going to be about trust, because you are not going to open up unless you trust the group that you're having those conversations with.
Great. Thank you. Marie, can we go to you next?
Yes, I was thinking about the information that was brought forward as the Unite Initiative was getting launched, and the challenge, again, yes, of trust and concerns of reprisals if people are truly open. It is work. One of the beautiful things about the 80 plus people I said have become my best friends is that we have people from all job categories, from all career stages, multiple walks of life, and it's allowed us as that group to have a lot of really important conversations. And as we've tried across NIH to begin thinking really carefully about what we need to do moving forward, we've had some outside groups to help us to begin those conversations. And we're having more and more in the way of listening sessions. And we're having more and more of gathering the data and trying to break down the data. But it gets to be really tough when there is that concern about trust. I'm thinking to when we were addressing the issue of harassment in the biomedical setting, and how bravely some women came forward to talk about their experiences. And then subsequently it's reported that some of them experienced reprisals. So people are taking risks when they open themselves up, and we have to develop as supportive and as trusting an environment as possible, and be aware that we, even with that, may not get the full stories because of those concerns.
Very helpful. Thank you. And Ellen, could you share as well?
Sure. Just in thinking about first the National Science Board, I mentioned about a year ago at our meeting, we did have a panel, external panel, to discuss the Black experience in STEM. Mm-hmm. However, you can imagine, of course, this was a virtual panel, but you have the panel talking to 24, 25 members of the National Science Board with a number of other people that can tie in since it's open to the public. That's probably not going to be the place where you really get the authentic, true, and personal stories. It's just not the conducive environment, right? So I'm thinking a little bit more maybe of some of my experiences at NASA. And one of the things that we did when I was director of Johnson Space Center is we were trying to help our leadership understand how to have these more personal conversations with the people in their organizations. So we developed what we called an inclusive leadership cadre. And we had a subset of our senior managers kind of go through some training about how do you have sort of difficult and emotional conversations with employees. And then they would get together with small groups in their own organizations. And then we tried to take that down to the next level of supervisor and sort of step it down so that we would have a variety of conversations. But, of course, it was optional for any employees to actually participate in these conversations. But I think it really showed particularly the supervisors and maybe particularly those who have always been in the majority culture who just don't think about it. They assume other people have the same sort of experience every day at work that they do, to realize that actually people have very different experiences, even in the same buildings, in the same environment, the same agency. And we know awareness is only a step in the journey, but it's a really important first step for people to understand that we have to take more steps.
That's great. So I'm going to have one last question for our esteemed panelists before we wrap it up. And one thing that I was thinking about, the challenge before us is daunting. But, we're ending this session with vision, thinking about the future. What gives you hope? What gives you some hope about, yeah, it's daunting, but here's what I'm hopeful for the future. And Ellen, since you were just having the floor, let's go back to you.
Well, having this summit is something. And, I think there's a lot of emphasis on what have we learned? What have we learned about what works and what doesn't work? Because we know that even though a lot of things have been tried, when you talk about have we really moved the needle in most ways, in most things that you measure, we haven't. And this is something we talk about at the board and in NSF all the time. How do you actually move the needle? But I think when you bring together a lot of information about here's what we see, what works, and you combine it with, I think there's just a greater sense we really have to be focusing on this, or at least it's much more widespread than it used to be. I'm certainly in on a lot more conversations now than I ever used to be about this topic. So those are the things that at least give me hope as we move forward. And we're certainly going to continue to be pushing it from the board aspect.
Oh, thanks for that. Marie, we'll go to you next.
So when I think about where we are now and what led us here, particularly the pandemic, the videotape murder of George Floyd, I truly do believe that it was a tipping point, just like back during the Civil Rights era when you saw the hoses being turned on people and dogs being let out on people. It made us as a country step back and say, this is not who we are. This is not right. We need to do something better and different. And I think we're in a similar place right now. And that leaves me with a lot of hope, because I think that accelerates the conversations. It accelerates the desire to do things and the follow through on those actions. So I'm very hopeful, because I think we're in an accelerating phase, and that we're going to get a lot of things accomplished.
Awesome. And Shirley.
So I know as a scientist, I should probably agree with Ellen that we understand so much more today about the nature of bias than we did in the past, and that gives us tools. But as an educator, I have to say my hope always comes from the next generation and from conversations that I have with my students about their commitment to social justice. I think they're not going to let us turn back the clock. Mm-hmm. And that gives me hope.
Well, that's great. What a great way to end a very stimulating panel. I'd like to thank Dr. Tilghman, Dr. Bernard, and Dr. Ochoa. We really appreciate this way of ending our last session and thinking about the future and the vision for moving forward. So thank you so much. That concludes our session. And I will now move to some concluding remarks about our day and how we might end the whole summit. So I'd like to start by expressing gratitude to our speakers and all of our participants for joining us over the past 2 days. Hopefully the summit has served as a connector and as an accelerant for all of us on our journey to achieve a more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and anti-racist enterprise for science, engineering, and medicine, and society at large. We are also grateful for the leadership of the National Academies for rising to this challenge at hand, spurred by the requests from Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, and we're grateful for the support that we've had from our sponsors. Secondly, let me reiterate our call to action. The need for meaningful and lasting action is urgent. Piecemeal, half-hearted approaches are insufficient. What is needed now is a systems approach to a systemic problem. Multi-level, longitudinal, integrated, and sustained efforts that address root causes that were covered by our experts over these 2 days of our summit. Whether one ascribes to an instrumental rationale, such as diversity providing educational and economic benefits, or to a moral imperative for diversity as the right thing to do, the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion is undeniable, and the harm done by not ensuring diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism is untenable. In today's first session, exploring the importance of diversity, we learned the importance of intentionality and accountability and partnership across sectors. We also learned that on a level of basic human behavior, manners in the guise of inclusion and presence listening matters. We challenged the notion that diversity and equality are mutually exclusive, and we saw examples such as that of self-formed affinity groups and networks. One example was given called 8-Ball Posse, which was a group of Black students at a major research institution that formed their own affinity group and networked to help each other succeed, and they were all successful and have wildly successful careers. We also heard about examples of success in the academy and industry and the significant societal contributions of racial and ethnic minorities. It was emphasized that we can't afford to underutilize intellect and waste talent. In that vein, it was noted that, as shown through research studies, faculty can play a significant role in subtle and not so subtle signaling to students from underrepresented and underserved groups that impacts their career trajectories. The National Academy's commitment to exploring and supporting diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism in science, engineering, and medicine is manifested through numerous efforts, namely, numerous completed and ongoing studies, reports, and workshops have documented and spoken about the nature and extent of the problem of underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities in science, engineering, and medicine, including the negative impact and cost to society. The Academies continues to look for opportunities to provide evidence-based strategies and to continue work in their strategic plan and moving forward. Through the very active roundtable on Black men and Black women in science, engineering, and medicine, a broad array of stakeholders address both barriers and opportunities impacting the advancement of Black men and Black women along academic and professional pathways. The National Academy of Engineering has convened a committee on racial equity and justice and has issued a call to action. Quoting John Slaughter, "We must let opportunity meet talent." The committee has already had an impact on increasing the number of nominations of underrepresented minorities for Academy membership. The National Academy of Medicine has extensive programming around the culture of health and racism and health equity. And as we heard yesterday and again today, factors that contribute to persistent underrepresentation of members of racially minoritized groups and racial inequities are complex and interconnected, and they operate at individual, institutional, and societal levels. This complexity begs a systems approach for structural change, yet interventions tend to be directed at the individual level. A systems approach would be useful in addressing the gatekeeping, the opportunity hoarding, and the elitism that starts early and continues throughout the career pathway. Later life experiences and opportunities are shaped by early educational and life experiences, from a lack of educational opportunities to social norming. All along the way, talent is lost. Opportunity hoarding is particularly problematic at the level of post-secondary education, as members of the dominant group serve as gatekeepers for access to resources. And faculty and administrators can serve as gatekeepers themselves when their behaviors serve to discourage members of racially minoritized groups. Academic elitism, whereby the academic system tends to devalue women and underrepresented minorities who do not hail from prestigious schools in comparison with those who do, further limits opportunities. A systems approach is also needed to fully understand and provide what is needed to ensure that the culture and environment within our institutions, workplaces, and organizations is diverse, inclusive, supportive, and devoid of bias. We must recognize and support diverse origins, experiences, identities, and goals, while acknowledging the way racial attitudes and identities emerge and change. While we would like to believe that bias training is critical, research by Dr. Dobbin and his colleagues suggests that attempts to quash bias, in this case they meant the idea that you can train away bias or regulate bias or punish bias, are unsuccessful. Research also suggests that having managers involved in democratizing career systems is an effective means of diversifying the workforce, as well as diversifying leaders. The democratized career system that can impact diversity, equity, and inclusion has 4 key components: recruitment, mentoring, work life, and training. Development opportunities such as formal mentoring holds promise. Notably, Dr. McGee points out, the best mentoring program cannot eradicate centuries of white supremacy in STEM. End of quote. Dr. McGee also pointed out the stark absence of Blacks and other underrepresented racialized minorities in the STEM and medicine narrative. For example, there's never been a Black Nobel laureate. Also, there's the history of systemic racism leads to a hostile and toxic environment that serves to limit participation. There is so much that the nation can learn from historically Black colleges and universities, fondly known as HBCUs, based on their history, experience, and contributions. Since their founding in the late 19th and 20th centuries, HBCUs have long played a transformative role in the country, leading the struggle against racism and providing a culture of excellence as producers of key Black talent. I'm an alumna of Xavier University of Louisiana, and I can personally attest to the culture of excellence, the investment in students, and the sense of belonging described by President Barrett. At Xavier, I benefited from a culturally concordant experience that embraced and supported my identities and helped undergird my professional success. We heard about a number of programs and practices that are promising in addressing structural barriers and biases, including the need for, among other things, additional research, historical context, racial consciousness, and structural incentives. We learned that programs that value Black girls and tend to their needs have been met with success. Similar to HBCUs and other MSIs, tribal colleges provide supportive and tailored environments. They provide scaffolding and strategies that have also proven successful. We learned that stereotypes are a real challenge, and as noted by Dr. Steele, trust is a major problem at the core. Building trust will certainly help us ensure inclusive environments. Stereotype inoculation model was described by Dr. Dasgupta as a social vaccine to help underrepresented minorities navigate their career paths. She mentioned a number of things that served as a social vaccine, including a connection between content and social meaning, as well as exposure of female students to female professors. In our final session, we took a moment to reflect and envision the work to come. We examined NIH's initiative Unite that specifically addresses structural racism. We learned about the National Science Board, the National Science Foundation, and their steps to find missing millions and prioritize ending structural racism in the scientific enterprise. We learned from Dr. Tilghman the importance of partnership between government, academy, and industry, and the broader community to make a seismic shift. So as we look to the future, our emphasis should be on transformative and sustained change that eradicates systemic racism and closes the opportunity gaps. In a paper commissioned by the academies, Dr. Malcolm Piquet provided multiple examples of transformations in higher education that serve as evidence of what wide-scale transformation this nation is capable of when motivated to invest. Of the transformations she interrogated, a few of them were the founding of the colonial colleges, and as Dr. Steele mentioned, formed in the apartheid context, the Morrill Land Grant College Acts, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1994, also referred to as the GI Bill, and the space race. These transformations have certainly made a difference, but what they all lacked was a goal of ending racial inequity. Failure to fully understand the systemic and structural nature of racism and bias, and failure to recognize and mitigate concomitant barriers will prolong the underrepresentation and lack of progression of racial and ethnic minorities. The creation of inclusive environments supported by policies and practices that informed by systemic data collection and analysis, along with leadership, assessment, and the implementation of effective strategies to promote advancement, represent an important approach to alter our course. Considering accountability, we must hold the academy and leaders within it, also industry and leaders within industry, government and organizations, to go beyond empty statements and broken promises, to make real cultural shifts and changes. We have learned so much over the course of these 2 days in the summit about what is possible. We know with good intentions, purpose, and action to meet those intentions, we can and will make a difference. I like to end the way I started, with thanks and appreciation to the academies and sponsors, organizers, speakers, participants. Thanks to all of you who have stuck it out with us. Thank you for the work that you've already done. And thank you for the work that you will be doing in the future. So with that, again, I'd like to wrap up what has been a very exciting and stimulating summit and say thank you on behalf of the academies and all who have been involved. Wishing you all the best as we work together on this journey. Thank you.